Tonight, I'll be showing you how to create professional grade looks for your YouTube videos using the exact software used by Hollywood movie producers, DaVinci Resolve's color page. And you don't even need to break the bank on an expensive camera, because in this video, you'll learn how to create a pro color grade for any camera, whether it be a webcam, your phone, or a DSLR. We'll cover how to use the color wheels and power windows to get even a Logitech webcam looking good. I'll show you how to take advantage of the HDR setting on your smartphone using color space transform and custom curves. And finally, I'll take you through the full grade of footage from my mirrorless camera, taking advantage of an impressive grading tool exclusive to Resolve's color page. This is Crash Course Resolve. Let's dive in. We're actually gonna start with grading the webcam. The low quality means that our creative possibilities are a bit limited, but it's gonna be the easiest for me to show you the basics. Once you have your footage in the timeline, go ahead and click on over to the color page and it will look like you just got sat down in the pilot seat of the motherfucking Starship Enterprise. We're gonna break it down to basics. The color page uses nodes similar to the Fusion page, but it's not nearly as complicated as the Fusion page. Check it out. If I press Alt-S a couple times, it will create a string of nodes. Basically, all you have to think about it is a series of steps. You can add as many changes and effects to each node as you want, but sometimes we want things to happen in a certain order. And also you can turn on and off any node anytime you like, so you can see a good before and after for each effect. I'm gonna go ahead and make a total of 9 nodes for the webcam's grade. You can click and drag and select and move as many nodes as you like. I always like to leave the first node blank so we can always go back and reference it. There's 2 main ways to color grade. There's the primaries and then there's the curves. Now, starting with node 2, I'm gonna do pretty much the entire grade for the webcam in the primaries. I think by default, it starts you out on the color wheel, so we're gonna start there. On the top and bottom rows here, you have controls that work pretty much like camera controls. You've got temperature, tint, contrast, saturation, stuff you would find in your camera settings. And here's where you can make basic corrections to those if you didn't quite get them right in the camera. So for example, here I reduced the saturation on my webcam. So now we can add that saturation back in by taking the saturation slider and cranking it to 100. That already made kind of a huge difference. So I'm gonna leave that in its own node and move on to the third node. From here on out, we're gonna be dialing in the details. So now's a good time to talk about the scopes. I'll just go ahead and click the expand button so I can pop it out and then move it over here so that we can get a better look. I'll also open up the quad view so you can see all the scopes at once. Basically, these are all like the technical readouts that tell you all of the color information in your video. I believe this is what most of it looks like by default. If you want your vector scope to be more useful, I highly recommend copying my settings here, especially the show 2x zoom and the show skin tone indicator. We'll talk more about those later. Basically, your monitor is not perfect at displaying exactly what the colors of your image are gonna look like on every monitor. So even if your monitor is not perfect, or if your eyes aren't perfect for that matter, these are just tools to help you get more consistent color grades. So the scope I use the most is the vector scope. This is basically a little compass telling you where all the colors in your image lie. This white line here is called the skin tone indicator, and that's generally speaking where you're gonna want your skin tones to lie. What's useful about this is that we can see I have a lot of blue and magenta lights in my room, and that's affecting where my skin tone is coming through on the camera. So to pull my skin away from magenta and blue, I'm gonna pull it towards green and yellow by using the tint and temperature sliders. Tint will go to about there, and temperature will set to maybe about there. I left most of the skin tones still a little bit to the right of the line because I do still want it to look natural in the magenta and blue lighting, but aligning it more toward the line means I get to keep the influence of the lighting, but still have good natural looking skin tones in the image. Next thing I'm noticing I want to change is that I'm noticing that it's a little bit bright, specifically in kind of like the details and the skin tones and the midtones here. So for that, I am actually going to go to the color wheels. You can think of offset as affecting the entire image. So if I take this point here in the center and drag it towards blue, it makes the whole image a little bit more blue. You can always click reset here. These little RGB values down here, you can actually click and drag and change them up. You can also type whatever values into them, and you can also double click at any time the little icons underneath them to reset them. That way, if you like what you did with green but want to reset blue, you don't have to reset the whole thing. And then lastly, this little slider here at the bottom affects all 3 equally. So you can think of this almost like a brightness slider. Lift, gamma, and gain all work exactly the same way. They all 3 affect the entire image, but they all 3 affect the image differently. Essentially, think of lift as the darks, the gains as the lights, and the gamma as kind of the midtones. So for example, if I shift gain towards red, the whole image becomes red, but you can see in the dark parts of this curtain that The blacks are mostly still black. The dark parts aren't affected as much as the bright parts. The opposite goes for lift. If I start dragging that towards a green, you'll see the shadows and the dark areas of the image turn green, but the brighter areas stay mostly the color that they were. Gamma then tries to leave the darks and the lights alone and affects the midtones. Since I think it's kind of bright in the midtones, I'm just gonna drag the gamma down a few points. And then I'm gonna click over here to the log wheels. These behave a little bit differently. Color wheels mostly affect only the regions that they're supposed to be affecting, but they do affect the entire image. The log wheels will only affect the regions they belong to. So if I come over here to the shadows wheel and I drag it towards blue, you'll see the oranges and bright parts of the image remain completely unchanged. It's only the dark parts that have turned toward blue. In the parade and the histogram here, I'm noticing that there's a lot more blue and green information in the shadows than there is red. So I'm gonna bring the green and the blue down just a little bit to match where the red lies. And then I'm gonna go ahead and darken all of the shadows by using the wheel. So next thing I'm noticing is that my skin looks very flat, but there's actually a lot of details that can be seen in the background. So I'm actually going to add some detail into my skin and take it away from everything in the background. To do that, we're gonna use this page called the Qualifier. I'll go ahead and click on over to node 4. And then with the picker selected, I'm just gonna drag it over my skin. We don't see anything at first, but if we hit Shift H, it will actually give us a preview of our selection. Right now, I'm kind of looking like that dude at the end of Jeepers Creepers. I was gonna show a clip. I don't think I can do that. I will definitely get demonetized. And it's not because it's copyrighted. If I click on this plus button and drag it over more of my skin and a little bit of my shirt, we can get a little bit more of a clean selection. I wanted to pick up less of the pink stuff here in the background, so I could use the little -1 and drag it over there, or we can start affecting the selection manually using these HSL sliders. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten up the hue and then drag the luminance slider down a little bit. Now I'm gonna come back to our primaries tab and go to mid details and crank those up to about 50. Now if I press Shift H again to disable the preview, and then I hit Control D to give you a little bit of a before and after, you can see the details that pop out of my skin now. Next, to draw those details out of everything else, the easiest way to do that, I'm actually gonna come up here and delete node 5. And then while I have node 4 selected, I'm gonna right click, go down to add node and hit add outside. Now, if we Shift H, you can see everything but my skin and shirt are selected. And with that, we can set the mid detail to -50. And then with a little bit of a before and after, it's subtle, but just a little bit of the bright details are taken out of the background so that our eyes are drawn just a little bit more to our subject. Every time I do a key with the qualifier, I always leave a blank reference node afterwards that I can always preview with Shift H if I'm going through all the nodes. Next, I notice my teeth and my white shirt have kind of been casualties to our skin tone adjustments, so I'm gonna go ahead and start keying those out as well. This time I'll adjust the saturation to get rid of my skin. And because our selection's kind of blotchy, we're gonna blend it a little bit by coming over here to the matte finesse and blurring it. Next, I'll go back to our color wheels and I'll bring the gain up just a little bit. And I'll remove just a little bit of the saturation. You can see my shirt and teeth just look a little bit more natural and a little bit more like I've been to the dentist in the last. I used a key there, so node 8 will be a reference node. But now with our last node, I want to introduce you to the Power Windows tab. This lets you make changes to literal specific areas on the image instead of by color selection. So we can go ahead and click the circle, and by default, it puts it in the center of the image. What I want to do is I want to direct more focus to the center of the image, so I'm going to create what's called a vignette. Basically, we're going to darken the edges of the image. So I'm going to grab the corner and drag, and it's going to increase the size. Then I'll grab the edge of this little outer circle here and expand, and that's going to increase the softness. I want it to be pretty soft, so I'm going to go ahead and stretch that out quite a bit. This little button right here tells you whether or not the inside or outside is what's being selected. So we'll go ahead and click it, and it will indicate that the outside is what's being affected. Then from there, for the vignette, I want the shadows to mostly remain the same, but I want to bring the brightness down on the edges. So I'm going to go to gain and drag the slider down. There we go, that's pretty good. And if you come up here and click this button, you can get a complete before and after. This is how we started straight out of the webcam, and this is what we ended up with. I'm pretty proud of getting a webcam to look that good. Now we can move on to our phone footage. I captured this using my Galaxy S10 Plus, and you'll notice it looks hella gray and flat and desaturated. So we gotta talk about log and HDR footage. Log is a mode that most phones and cameras ship with nowadays, except Panasonic for some reason. You might see it in your phone settings as HDR10 Plus. It basically allows your camera to capture detail in a greater range of light and shadows. It makes the image or video come out flat out of the box, but then you can manipulate it to be whatever you want afterward. If you have it, it's worth learning how to use, but it's not the end of the world if you don't have access to it either. Now I could come down here to like saturation and contrast and start correcting the log footage to look more like Rec. 709 manually, but as you can probably tell, it's not always gonna work and it's not always the best idea. So let's go ahead and right click and hit reset node grade. Now let's instead come down here later down the line to node number 4. And now we're gonna open up the effects tab. Now here I'm gonna scroll down here to Resolve FX Color and grab Color Space Transform and drag it and put it onto my node. Here we're gonna select the input color space and gamma of the footage. If you don't know what color space and gamma your camera records in or your phone records in, you can check it using the website I have in the description below. Galaxy S10, at least I know, records in Rec. 2100 with an input gamma of Rec. 2100 ST2084 or whatever that is. Now you might be asking, why did we go through all that trouble to record in HDR and log just to convert it back in post? First of all, I manually converted it to Rec. 709 on my phone, and it lost a lot of that information and detail that Resolve retains when using Color Space Transform. But you'll also notice here the 2 nodes we have before the Color Space Transform. We can actually make adjustments and changes before the transformation and keep that dynamic range. So let's head back to node number 2. And for this one, I'm gonna mostly use the curves instead of the color wheels. The graph on Curves Custom is basically like a layout of the colors in our image from dark to light. I'm gonna click on these 3 dots and then click Editable Splines, and that's gonna give us splines on each end. With the highlight point selected, I can click this spline and I can drag this up, and that's gonna kind of brighten the image, but smoothly over the high parts of the image. Then on node 3, I'll go over to a different curves tab. We'll go to hue versus hue. This is basically gonna tell Resolve, hey, take these colors in the image and shift them more towards this color. So while this page is highlighted, I can actually come up here and kind of select my skin tones, and it will automatically put a node on the graph where my skin tones lie. As you can see, they're way over here in like the red magenta area. You can see it on the vector scope as well. This point that's selected is kind of our midpoint, and the points on either end of it are kind of the points that are kind of the barriers for it. So I'm gonna click on both of those, and I'm gonna click on the input hue, and I'm just gonna drag them more to either side. This way our skin point here affects more colors. Next I'll grab hue rotate, and I'll keep an eye on the image and the vector scope as I drag it one way or the other. Dragging it up brings it more towards pink, which I want to do the opposite of, so I'm going to drag it down quite a bit. I'm noticing too it's not grabbing enough of my skin tones, so I am going to go ahead and drag this even more out to the right. Now the further I push it, the more unnatural it's going to look, even though we're getting closer to where the skin tone should be, because my skin and my shirt and all that isn't really matching up with the light that's giving it its color. So I am going to go ahead and grab the temperature and tint. There we go. With those 3 dialed in, we're much closer to our natural skin tones. And if we do a before and after, that is a dramatic shift towards something that looks a lot more believable. For this 5th node, we're gonna speed run these last couple different kinds of curves. First, we'll go to hue versus saturation. This is where you can make certain colors pop and certain colors a little bit more muted. Here, I'm gonna click this little blue icon, and that's gonna automatically create a node on the color blue. And then I'm just gonna start dragging the slider down a little bit. I'm gonna take the magenta end of the spectrum as well and drag that quite a bit to the right, and go ahead and shift this blue node over more towards where the peak is. Here's a before and after already. That's pretty good. I am gonna go back to hue versus hue, and I'm gonna create a node on the blue and pink points. I'm gonna take pink and I'm gonna drag it more towards red. And then I'm gonna take blue and I'm gonna drag it upwards more towards cyan. This way we get a little bit more blue and pink rather than just this purple mess. I'll go ahead and come to hue versus luminance, and I think I'll go ahead and darken blue and pink as well. Since blue and pink make up mostly our background, that darkens the background and brings more attention on me as the subject, but it still looks natural because the lights are still blown out and the lights are still affecting the area around me. Now, if we go to luminance versus saturation, I use this in almost all of my grades when you want like clean blacks and clean whites. Let's, for example, go to our first node and drag it all the way to blue. Now, even in the whites of my shirt and the blacks of the curtain behind me, you see blue. If I go back to our 5th node and now I go back to luminance versus saturation, and I create a node here and drag this down, you'll notice our blacks kind of go back to black. And if I do the same thing with whites, the white comes back to my shirt. So I tend to add this to just about all of my grades as like a stylistic choice, and you can roll it off here as well. This saturation versus saturation curve lets you just say, hey, if something's super saturated, make it a little bit less saturated. Or if something's not as saturated, make it more saturated. Most often I see people just taking this far end here and just dragging it down just a little bit just to roll off the saturation from the super saturated parts of the image. The last curves page is saturation versus luminance. I don't always find a use for this one. You basically say, hey, if something has no color, make it dark. Or if it has a lot of color, make it light. It's really only useful in like really niche situations and probably with minor adjustments. Anyways, it's looking pretty good. I noticed that because we recorded in HDR that my skin is just a little sharp and the lighting's just a little bit harsh. So on this last node, I think we're just gonna take down a little bit of the mid detail. And there's a little bit of a before and after of our phone grade. So moving on finally to the footage from my GH5, you'll notice I don't record in log because I don't have access to it, but I do record in like a low saturation, low contrast profile that works pretty similar. You can usually get a pretty similar result by just bringing down the contrast and saturation in your camera settings. So this one, we are once again going to have 9 nodes. So this one, we're gonna do something a little bit different. We're gonna start from node 3. And since we didn't record in log, we don't really have a color space to transform from. So instead, we're gonna come up here in the top left to LUTs. LUTs are similar to a color space transform in that it tells Resolve essentially what to do with the colors of your image, but it's usually to achieve a certain look rather than to transfer it from one format to another. So we're gonna come down here to the folder Film Looks, which comes with Resolve. Now these are made to emulate the way that like big budget Hollywood movie cameras that print to film actually bake the colors into their film. You can try a couple of these out. My favorite happens to be this one, but you'll notice it makes the image look interesting to say the least. That's why we're throwing the LUT into node 3 so we can make some changes before the LUT hits the footage. So the first thing obviously is that there's way too much blue. So I'll set the blue in the offset to like 22, and then I think I'll even take the hue slider and slide it a little bit away from blue. And I think I'll bring the lift down slightly, taking a little bit of the purple and blue out. And we'll go ahead and bring the gamma up quite a bit. From here, we could definitely use a lot more saturation. So I'm gonna go ahead and add maybe up to 60. And then I think I'll even add a little bit of color boost. We'll put that to 15 or so. And from here, I think I'm just gonna go over to log and take just a little bit of blue and green out of the midtones. I'll tell you what though, the film LUT is still a little bit harsh on my skin and in the dark areas. So I'm gonna move my scopes here and come down here to the key. And here, if we set the gain to like 2/3, that gives us just a little bit more of an evened out look. Now on the other side of my LUT, I want to move towards separating out the blue and the pink and getting rid of all this purple in here. So I'm going to go back to curves and I'm going to go back to hue versus hue and adjust my blue and pink curves accordingly. That's looking much more in the ballpark of what I like. Little before and after action there. You can see the pink just pops so much more. On the next node here, I'm going to go to hue versus saturation and I'm going to take out a little bit of the saturation in the blue and pink. We'll just go ahead and get rid of one of the nodes and then split the difference. That should be 166. We'll bring the saturation down to about 0.6 or so. And then I'm gonna do the exact same thing on hue versus luminance. Now with the blue and pink darkened, they still pop, but they blend in a little bit better with the background so that the focus is more on the subject. Now on the 6th node, I'm gonna come to saturation versus saturation, and I'm gonna add just a gentle roll off curve here just to get rid of a little bit of that color bleed in my shirt and in the background. I'm gonna do the same thing with luminance versus saturation to give us a little bit more of the clean blacks in the shadows. So the 7th node, this is the moment you've been waiting for. We're gonna use my favorite tool in Resolve, the color warper, which you can find by kind of clicking over to the spider web thing. For this step, I'm gonna switch our scopes down to dual view and I'm gonna set them in this corner and kind of have them switch places with the color warper. By default, it'll look something like this. I forget actually what the default settings are. You can change the defaults by clicking on these 3 dots here for the default hue and default saturation resolution, and you can change them down here in the corner. I'm gonna set them to max for right now. You can basically think of this spider web as a mapping of every single color on this scope. In fact, you can actually come up to these dots and click show skin line and it will show the skin tone indicator in the same places on the scope. In this image, I'm noticing that there's a lot of color contrast in my skin. You'll notice my skin is on both sides of the skin tone indicator pretty widely. So with this color warper, I'm gonna take all of the skin tone colors and bring them in towards the skin tone line to make my skin look just a little bit more smooth. Natural, pretty. First, I'll select this edge more towards kind of yellow and grab this hue slider and drag it more towards red. And I'll do the same with this one, but just a little bit less drastic, I think. And then the same with this one. And now you can see on the vector scope, my skin tones are just much tighter aligned to that line. As per usual though, I'm not a fan of what it's done to my teeth. So if you want to know what hue something is and where it lines up on the graph exactly, you can actually hover your color picker over it and it will tell you exactly which hue it is. I'm also gonna switch on over to HSP log mode to allow for a little bit more precision. So we can see the skin tones are lining up a little bit more with that dot, and the teeth are lining a little bit more with this dot. So we can adjust this one without adjusting our skin tones too much. I'll go ahead and drag the saturation down a little bit. A couple notches is probably enough. And as you can see, a little bit goes a long way. You may not even be able to tell the difference, but I can. And it's okay sometimes to get the details right that only you will appreciate. And with that done, there's only a couple more things I wanna do before we call this look complete. If we come to node 8, I wanna come down to mid details as always and smooth out some of the granular detail on my forehead and skin. And then this last part is optional. We're gonna add an effect called halation. This is only available if you have the studio version of Resolve. You can just open up the search bar and search that up. And that is what I would call a finished grade. I went ahead and fine-tuned a couple other details to my liking and came up with this. This is probably the grade I'm using in this video right now that you see me in. Cool. If you want to learn more about color grading and Resolve in general, be sure to drop a subscription so that you get notified when a new Crash Course Resolve video goes live. Thank you for watching. I'm going to bed now. It's 2 in the morning.